Many people have their idols, famous personalities who have achieved something in this life, actors, athletes, musicians. But do we know the people on the cover that we like only superficially? After all, we don't know for sure what idols are really like when we interact with them closely. One day, an aspiring rapper named Bryce Rambo decided to throw his followers a party. Everything was going well until at some point the man out of the blue started yelling that his money had been stolen. What's more, he even knew which of the group of people was dirty. Brice Rhodes was born on August 9, 1991. He grew up in the city of Louisville, Kentucky. His upbringing was taken care of by his mother, Shawn, who could not be called very caring and responsible. As Brice himself later said in an interview, his childhood was filled with trauma and violence, which had a huge impact on the rest of his life. Brice's home life was quite messy and chaotic. This resulted in the boy having an extremely low intelligence level. He struggled with attention, deficit hyperactivity disorder, and also suffered from bipolar disorder. When Bree was 15 years old, he had the cognitive abilities of a preschooler. No matter how hard he tried to grasp the amount of information that was given in school, he simply could not do it. As a result, he was stunted. Because of the inability to express emotions in words, he began to organize fights at school and constantly struggled with bouts of aggression. At the same time, his mother Shauna did nothing, and Brice never received any psychiatric help. On top of everything else, the guy was described as an incredible slacker. He avoided any responsibilities, from schoolwork to chores. After Brice dropped out of school, his only burning desire was to join a gang. He had no other dreams or aspirations, only the desire to be a part of something serious, to feel his own importance. Only there was a problem. None of the local gangs wanted him in their ranks. No matter how much Brice begged and pleaded to be accepted into the criminal organization, he was chased by rejections everywhere. Brice was simply shunned. As an 18-year-old teenager, and Brice was just at the beginning stages of adolescence, it seemed that he had to prove himself to these gangsters and show that he was strong, mature, and fearless. Nothing better came to his mind than to take part in an armed robbery. Brice decided, along with 9 other young men, to rob a group of teenagers, and it actually had devastating consequences. On April 24, 2009, around 9 p.m., Rhodes and a small group of boys were hanging around outside a Jeffersonville basketball club when 4 high school students came out of the building and settled on a bench to wait for their parents to pick them up. Brice and his buddies surrounded the teens and, threatening them with guns, wanted to rob them. One of the company had a semi-automatic pistol. He handed it to Brice. And he suddenly felt like a hardened gangster and decided to demonstrate toughness. He took the gun and put it to the head of one of the teenagers, demanding that the school children give up all their valuables. The teens were absolutely terrified. They immediately began emptying their pockets. As a result of the armed attack, Brice and his accomplices managed to collect $45 in cash and 2 cell phones, after which they fled the scene. Naturally, the teens immediately reported the incident to their parents, who contacted the police. Just a few days later, Brice was tracked down, and the students identified him as the gun-toting criminal. Brice was arrested and charged with armed robbery. The newly minted gangster was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Without ever becoming a member of a real gang, Brice went to jail. After that, his life became a series of arrests, imprisonments, and releases. Brice was just over 20 when he was released early from prison. It didn't take long for him to violate his probation and end up behind bars again, and it happened several times. After serving a short time, he would get out on parole. Then Brice would re-enter the law and go to prison for violating his parole. Once on the outside, the young man managed to commit several different offenses, including bullying charges, domestic violence charges, use of illegal drugs, and theft. And worst of all, Brice was also charged with foul molestation of an underage girl, for which he was placed on the sex offender registry. After finally serving his primary sentence, Brice settled with his mom and younger sister in Louisville, Kentucky. They now lived in an apartment building. Some thought that being in a correctional facility would teach the guy something, and he would mature, change his lifestyle, his behavior, get on the path of correction. But that didn't happen. As soon as he was released from prison, he got in trouble with the police again. Brice beat up his mother and threw a stool at her. As a result, the woman was hospitalized. However, she did not press any charges against her son, and he got away with it. It should come as no surprise that it soon happened again. In September 2014, he did the same thing. Brice attacked his mother as she was putting away groceries in the refrigerator. For some reason, the guy just freaked out, lost his temper. He grabbed Shauna by the neck and punched her in the face several times. The woman fell to the floor. It is not known how it would have ended if Brice's sister, who was at home at the time, had not called the police. Instead of jail time, Brice got probation. So, naturally, the same incident happened again, only now with Brice's girlfriend. She happened to get pregnant. Of course, it's not a good idea to have a child with a man like Brice. However, the realization of the mistake apparently came to her later. Brice and his girlfriend welcomed the birth of their child into the world. The birth of a baby, besides joy, also brings a lot of worries and new responsibilities. Not every parent handles it easily. Brice already had a rather aggressive, irascible character, and on the background of childish crying, sleepless nights, and other things, at some point turned into a real monster. In July 2015, there was an incident when he attacked his girlfriend, hitting her several times in the face. The worst part was that she was holding their 4-month-old baby boy in her arms, but this time, too, the man managed to get off with a suspended sentence, even though he was still on probation for assaulting his mother. Brice is now 23 years old. His desire to join a street gang hasn't gone away, only it was joined by his dream of becoming a musician. Brice positioned himself as an aspiring rapper. He composed unremarkable lyrics, shot video clips, and tried to become famous by releasing videos on YouTube. The young man took the pseudonym Rambo and fancied himself a rising star. All this was done again in order to be noticed by a gang leader and invited to his place. Brice was so deluded, so sincerely believed that his work was interesting to someone, that he kept recording more and more new compositions. As almost every homegrown rapper in his lyrics sounded such topics as crime, gangs, women, illegal substances, and weapons, naturally there were those who really liked his music. Everybody's tastes are different, but there are hundreds of thousands of rappers like Brice, and they all look alike, as if they were made to copy. Brice tried to be original. In his videos, he was often filmed without outerwear and only pants, showing his far from perfect body. As stated earlier, all this he did in order to become famous and get into the ranks of some gang. But neither music career, nor criminal history, nor other attempts to attract the attention of real mobsters did not succeed. Since no one ever called Brice to join a gang, he decided to create his own. He couldn't attract peers or older people, because they had to fear their leader and honor him. So Brice recruited young, vulnerable, impressionable teenagers to join his team. He wanted them to be easy to control, easy to manipulate. For most 14 and 16-year-olds, an ex-convict and a famous local rapper in one person was something like an idol. They would look up to him, aspire to be like him, dream of being subservient to him. Brice wanted people to think that he lived a life of luxury and had money, nice cars, expensive jewelry, clothes, girls, and other trappings of wealth. But of course, Brice had none of those things. He was just very good at pretending. The young guy, fired up with the idea of starting his own gang, hung around the local basketball courts and recruited teenagers. They were 13, 14, 15, and 16 years old. Brice would tell the students that he was a famous rapper, and if they were around him, they could also get their piece of the pie and become famous. They would get money, power, and respect. Brice used his music videos as a kind of creditability. He promised young followers participation in the filming of his videos, and many actually fell for it, wanting some of the benefits of this world. And Brice really kept up the appearance that he had a lot of money, that he was powerful and well-respected. To back up his words with actions, he would buy recruits in his gang clothes, buy them lunch, or just give them money. But he did not do it out of the goodness of his heart, but to bind them and make them debtors. At the same time, Brice still lived with his mom and was incredibly lazy. That's where the young followers came in handy. Teenagers did all the housework for him, washing clothes, buying groceries, cleaning rooms. He also forced them to participate in criminal activities, such as selling illegal substances, and this, apparently, was his main source of income. Members of Brice's small gang were loyal to their leader. Among them were two half-brothers, 14-year-old Larry Ordoy and 16-year-old Morris Gordon. They were both born in Louisville, Kentucky, and their mother was a woman named Elizabeth Rice. She gave birth to Larry and Rice at a fairly young age. They had different fathers, but neither was present in the lives of their sons. Their upbringing was handled by Elizabeth alone. It so happened that both boys were in the same class. Morris always had problems with his lessons, so he had to repeat a couple of times. But the schoolboy excelled in other areas. He loved music and was quite a gifted basketball player. His younger brother Larry, on the contrary, was an excellent student and was also good at sports. The brothers were inseparable, almost like twins, only 2 years apart. Morris's troubles began when one day at the age of 14 he was sent to a summer camp run by the local police department. The place was for at-risk youth, but instead of correcting their behavior, the campers came out even more angry at the world. At summer camp, the teenagers were treated horribly. Morris and others were bullied and abused by the police officers who ran the camp. Young people who broke the rules were often physically, mentally, and emotionally abused. They could be woken up in the middle of the night, taken outside, and forced to do push-ups. Sometimes they were punished with food and water. Teenagers had to drink rainwater because they were thirsty. All of this led to a hardening of the school children's hearts and a dislike for law enforcement, who essentially owned the camp. This childhood trauma remained deep in the soul of Morris. It had a profound effect on his school grades. It had been 2 years since the boy had been to summer camp. He and his brother continued to live their lives, played sports, and, in principle, did not cause much concern on the part of the school authorities. But one day the brothers met Brice Rhodes, and then everything went downhill. Neither Morris nor Larry did not dream of joining the gang, however, they had to do it. The thing is that the budding rapper Rambo started dating their mom, Elizabeth. After meeting her 2 sons, Brice decided that these were the kind of young and impressionable teenage boys his gang needed. When a romance began to develop between Brice and Elizabeth, the man took Larry and Morris under his wing. From that point on, the brothers hung out with their mom's boyfriend all the time. Wanting to impress the boys and their mother, Brice bought them various gifts, food, clothes, and promised them a luxurious life. He told them how he would become a famous rapper and the money would flow. The man began taking Larry and Iris to many parties, introduced them to alcohol, illegal substances, and made them realize that committing a crime was no big deal at all. Larry and Morris even started carrying Brice's guns. He was leading the teens down a very dangerous path, and their mother Elizabeth didn't seem to care at all. This kind of relationship between Brice, Larry, and Morris went on for months. The man forced them to do chores around the house and also involved them in criminal activities. Both teens sold illegal drugs, participated in robberies and burglaries. And all of this was only because Brice desperately wanted to belong to a gang. He basically didn't care about the danger he was putting all these underage high school kids in. Larry and Morris were basically Brice's right-hand men. They rode with him in his car all the time. In addition to the 2 brothers, there were several others in Brice's gang. They were 15-year-old Anjone Carter, who was friends with the brothers and was in the same class with them, his cousin 17-year-old Jacob Taylor, and 19-year-old Tyrone Coleman. All of these guys before meeting Brice were just regular high school kids, friendly and cheerful. Had they not met the aspiring rapper one day, their lives would have turned out very differently. With 5 very loyal followers, Brice felt like a strong and important leader of his own gang. However, that still didn't negate his desire to become a real mobster. In his heart, he probably realized that his entire gang was just a parody of real criminal organizations. In May 2016, 25-year-old Brice had a chance to prove himself to members of the real mafia. The aspiring rapper heard that a local gang was looking for someone to run errands for them. In return, this person would be paid a certain amount of money. But it wasn't the money that interested Brice at that moment, it was the opportunity to make a name for himself. If he could run an errand and make an impression, he might be accepted into a serious team. Brice approached the local members of the gang and said he was ready to fulfill the assignment. It turned out that the gang was looking for a hitman to eliminate one particular person. They did not explain the reason why the victim should be sent to the other world. And Brice wasn't really interested. He wanted to stand out from the crowd so badly that he was willing to go even for a serious crime. Meeting together, the gang members showed the photo and gave Brice details about the man they wanted to get rid of, his address, places he'd been, and other details. Brice took the assignment and promised to fulfill the order as soon as possible, and then began to draw up a plan of reprisal. On May 4th, 2016, rapper Bryce Rambo went for a car ride with his underage crew. 16-year-old Morris was behind the wheel, Brice was in the passenger seat, and 14-year-old Larry, 15-year-old Anjone, and 17-year-old Jacob were settled in the back. The guys were just having fun and had no idea what their leader was up to, and Brice was looking out the window, searching with his eyes for a future victim, the man the local gang had ordered for him. And then he saw him. It was 40-year-old Christopher Jones, a father of 2. He was described as an incredible man, an amazing husband, and a caring father who loved his family. The man was walking down the street, minding his own business, and unaware that these were his last seconds. Brice took one look at him and thought this was the man he was supposed to get rid of on behalf of a local gang. So he ordered Morris to stop the car, jumped out of the passenger compartment, and rushed over to the uncomprehending Christopher. Christopher didn't even have time to realize what had happened when Brice put a gun to his torso and pulled the trigger in cold blood. Everything happened so fast that the man didn't even have a chance to escape or at least defend himself. The bullet pierced Christopher. He was horribly injured and collapsed on the sidewalk. Meanwhile, Brice threw himself back into the car and ordered Morris to drive away. But the brothers didn't sign up to take anyone's life. They panicked and began to convince Brice that an ambulance should be called. You can't leave a person on the sidewalk bleeding. But Brice ordered the brothers to shut up and keep their mouths shut. If they ever told anyone about what happened here, they would be punished. The frightened teens fell silent, and under Brice's menacing shouts, Morris drove the car onward. Brice drove and mentally imagined how he would tell the gang members about the completed order, how he would be offered to become part of the group for a job well done, how he would finally fulfill his cherished wish. But he was mistaken. Christopher Jones was not the man the gang had ordered at all. Brice had made the mistake of relying on appearances and the neighborhood where everything happened. Christopher Jones was an upstanding, law-abiding citizen. He had done nothing wrong, had never been involved in mafia activity, and had nothing to do with the mafia. But now, because of a heinous mistake, the man lay on the sidewalk bleeding to death until passers-by noticed him and called an ambulance. Christopher was still alive, so he was rushed to the hospital. But due to serious injuries and lost time, the man died, his children lost their father, his wife lost her husband, and all just because Brice Rhodes desperately wanted to be part of the gang. Meanwhile, the enthusiastic hitman, who thought he had successfully carried out the attack, decided to reward his little teenage crew with lunch at the cafe, and at the same time gave them some warning that if they blabbed to anyone, the same thing would happen to them. After that, Brice went to the gang he was doing the order for and informed them that he had completed the job. It was then that he found out that he had taken the wrong man's life, which meant that not only did he not get the money for the order, but also made him look like a real idiot in the eyes of the gang members. The police opened an investigation into the death of Christopher Jones, but since there were no witnesses to the incident, detectives could not link Brice to the crime. After realizing who they had really messed with, brothers Larry and Morris finally realized that this was not at all the world they wanted to be a part of. The boys continued to panic and began to slowly distance themselves from the amateur rapper who had committed cold-blooded human carnage. Brice could see that Larry and Morris were scared and tried to avoid seeing him. They could be a burden to him. They could go to the police and ruin everything. Right now, the guys were really keeping their mouths shut as Brice continued to intimidate them. But what would happen then when he wasn't around? That question was beginning to worry him more than a little. Despite the silence, however, the brothers never forgot for a second what had happened. Over the next few weeks, Morris and Larry actually began to shun Brice. They no longer wanted to be a part of his gang because they saw the true face of their leader. But what worried them most was that when the police found out the details of the crime, which would happen sooner or later, they would indeed be considered accomplices and sent to prison to serve out the rest of their days. Brice apparently felt the panic of the two teens in his skin. He was no less paranoid than Larry and Morris, and so the man decided that he couldn't let the boys go to the police and tell them everything. He decided to take matters into his own hands. On May 21st, 2016, 17 days after the death of Christopher Jones, Brice made plans to throw an end-of-school party for Larry and Morris. Brice still lived in the apartment with his mother and sister. Normally, the house was always crowded with people coming and going. However, on that day, Brice's mom and sister were absent, so the apartment was left entirely to Brice. The rapper lured Larry and Morris to his place by pretending to throw a party for them. He picked them up in his car and brought them home. 3 other teens who were part of the gang, 15-year-old Anjone Carter, 17-year-old Jacob Taylor, and 19-year-old Tyrone Coleman, were already there. At first, it was business as usual. Brice periodically threw parties at his house where his gang members were present, so it didn't raise any suspicions among the brothers. They didn't realize yet that they had just walked into a trap. The teens were just hanging out. Suddenly, at some point, Brice snapped out of his seat and jumped up to Larry and Morris. The man started accusing them of allegedly stealing money from him. The schoolboys looked among themselves and didn't understand what they were being accused of. They tried to justify that they hadn't taken anything, but Brice had already moved on to other accusations against them. He started ranting about how he'd gotten word that the brothers had decided to frame their gang and had blabbed the crime to someone. Brice yelled at the boys, not letting them put a word in edgewise. He was actually acting out the act in front of the other teens to somehow justify what he was going to do next. It got to the point where the brothers took a defensive stance, trying to prove their innocence. In their hearts, they were afraid of Brice, but they didn't want others to think they were snitches. It wasn't until the rapper stated that he would abuse both brothers as punishment that Morris couldn't take it anymore. Angry at the unfounded accusations and threats against him, the teenager grabbed a knife lying on the table and began waving it in Brice's face. That's all the landlord wanted. He snatched the knife out of Morris's hand and ordered other members of his gang to grab the brothers and lock them in the bathroom. While Larry and Morris were locked up, Brice arranged a vote. He pressed that the boys were traitors and that they had exposed all the gang members. The man tried to convince the teens that they had a choice and offered to vote on whether Larry and Morris should live or should die. It is not known exactly who cast the votes, but the bottom line was that the brothers had to pay for their betrayal with their own lives. Brice ordered the other teens to first get Morris's older brother Morris out of the bathroom. The man then took a belt and tied the boy's hands behind his back before shoving a pair of socks into his mouth. A hat was pulled over Morris's head, completely covering his face, after which Brice began punching him. He beat the guy until he fell to the floor and groaned in pain. All the while, 14-year-old Larry sat in the locked bathroom and heard everything that was going on in the room. He could hear Morris screaming in pain and begging Brice to stop. Out of desperation, the younger brother began banging on the bathroom door, crying and screaming for Morris not to be touched. Larry swore they had never said a word to anyone about that shooting and never would. But Brice continued to beat the traitor until he lost consciousness. The man then took a knife and began stabbing Morris's body. He didn't want to take all the blame for the massacre, so he further handed the knife to Anjuan and said that they were a gang and should punish the traitors together. After Anjuan, Jacob took over and stabbed Morris's body as well. The only member who wasn't involved in all of this was Tyrone. Morris was left lying on the floor in a pool of blood as Brice ordered the teens to get Larry out of the bathroom. Seeing his brother tied up on the floor, the boy started screaming and crying even more. But he soon suffered the same fate. His hands were tied, his mouth gagged with a rag and a hat pulled over his face to further disorient him. Then Brice and the other gang members took turns stabbing him several times. The lives of two brothers were cut short on the same day. They were so young, talented, and could have done a lot of good in the future. But everything was changed by one meeting with a man who decided that his desire was more important than the life prospects of two teenagers. Having gotten away with massacring Christopher Jones, Brice apparently felt invincible. He knew those two could talk. By getting rid of the brothers, he'd made the rest of his little gang complicit. And that guaranteed Brice that now the teens would definitely keep their mouths shut for fear of going to jail. In the early morning hours of Sunday, May 22, 2016, Brice and the three teens loaded Larry and Morris's bodies into a car, drove them to the backyard of an abandoned house a couple blocks from Brice's apartment, and then built a large bonfire and disposed of the remains. When Brice set up the fire in the backyard of the abandoned house, he thought he had done it very competently, and no one would see the raging flames in the middle of the night. However, the fire actually got so big that the locals took notice. Back at Brice's apartment, 3 other teens cleaned up the crime scene with bleach and removed any possible evidence. After the landlord was satisfied with the cleanup, he took the boys to a coffee shop, fed them lunch as a small reward for the massacre of the 2 innocent brothers, and sent everyone home. Brice was glad that things had gone fairly smoothly. What he didn't know yet was that the locals had called the police after spotting a bonfire in the yard of an abandoned house. During the investigation, detectives quickly discovered 2 partially burned bodies. Since there was no identification on the victims, investigators first had to identify who the remains belonged to. Police presented 2 sketches to the public, hoping someone would recognize the boys. And a high school teacher who lived nearby suggested they were his students. 16-year-old Morris Gordon and his brother, 14-year-old Larry Ordway. A cover-up revealed that the older brother had been stabbed more than a dozen times and the younger brother more than 20. Investigators now faced the paramount task of finding who had done it. They interviewed people who lived in the neighborhood of the scene and those who knew the boys personally. It didn't take long for police to discover that Larry and Morris were last seen getting into local rapper Bryce Rambo's car the day before to go to a party. Unfortunately, the man was not found at home, but the name of 2 other teenagers who were present at the party were recognized. One of them turned out to be 15-year-old Anjone Carter, who studied with the brothers in the same class. After a short interrogation, the boy told the police everything that happened at the party on May 21st. The teenager was very remorseful that he took part in the attack on his classmates and was now ready to cooperate with the police. In addition, the guy admitted that they all witnessed the massacre of Christopher Jones, whom Brice shot right in the middle of the street. Detectives did not expect that working on one case can solve another crime, at first glance in no way related to the death of the boys. So now Brice Rhodes was suspected in the triple massacre, and a couple of days later, they managed to find him and bring him to the station for questioning. The man tried to pretend that he had no idea where the teenagers had gone. After the party, they went home, and what happened to them next, he didn't know. In general, Brice was a musician and had little interest in where the brothers had gone at night. However, this did not confuse the police, because at the same time, while some officers were interrogating the suspect, others were searching his apartment. Despite the best efforts of Brice's underage gang members to erase evidence and cover up the crime, blood was everywhere. So the landlord of the apartment was arrested and charged with 3 felonies ending in death when it all happened. The police also arrested Anjone Carter and kept him in custody, and then 2 other teens involved in the massacre of Jacob and Tyrone. They were also charged with assault. All of this happened in May 2016, and over the next 7.5 years, Brice Rhodes once again proved to everyone that he clearly had mental health issues. First of all, he immediately declared his innocence, hoping that he would get away with the deaths of 3 people like his previous crimes. When Brice shot a man by mistake, mistaking him for another man, he was still on probation for assaulting his mother and his girlfriend. Brice wreaked havoc everywhere he appeared, both in jail and in the courtroom. It all started when a defense attorney appointed by the state refused to represent Brice in court, citing a conflict of interest. It just so happened that the lawyer was friends with Larry and Morris's grandfather and couldn't defend the man who took both boys' lives. The lawyer explained the reason and apologized, but instead of understanding, he got a spit in the face from Brice, literally. In August 2016, the rapper got into a fight with another inmate, slashed his forehead, and told him he would send him to the other side of the world like the others. In September 2016, Brice got into a fight with another inmate, spitting in his face. A few weeks later, Brice became hysterical and refused to return to his cell. He began throwing cleaning supplies at guards and then broke a broom in half and began waving it in front of the guards' noses, threatening retaliation. 5 days later, Brice urinated in a bottle and splashed detention center staff with the contents. Because of his disgusting antics, he was sent to court wearing a mask that protected everyone else from his spitting. Rhodes was brought into the courtroom in a wheelchair. The defendant's arms and legs were fixed, as Brice's condition could not be called stable. Footage of Rhodes being brought to court in a wheelchair and wearing a mask to protect the public from spit went viral on social media, and the defendant was angry about becoming a laughingstock. After his release, he even threatened to finish off the judge and his entire family, blamed the prosecutor for the on-the-side affair, lashed out at his attorneys, and called court officials those who judge a person by the color of their skin. In January 2017, just months after all the courtroom drama, Brice was charged with attempted escape from custody. One day, guards were just searching the cells and discovered that Brice had dug a hole under the cinder blocks under his bed, a forbidden metal object. Throughout this time, Brice also sent threatening notes to other teens and his gang, calling them rats and threatening to kill them. In 2017, the rapper also decided to forgo the services of a lawyer and represent himself in court. Apparently, he considered himself smarter than lawyers. When Elizabeth Reese, the mother of the deceased Larry and Morris, appeared in the hall at one of the court sessions, the defendant turned around and sent her air kisses. This enraged the woman so much that she tried to attack Brice right in the courtroom. Brice ended up delaying the trial for a long 7 years. He refused to leave his cell, pretended to be insane. As a result, many psychological examinations had to be conducted to find out if he was ready to stand trial at all. However, while Brice was playing crazy, wanting to get as much attention to his person as possible, 3 teenagers involved in the massacre made a plea bargain and testified that Brice was the organizer of the crime and actually forced them to take part in it. And Joan Carter, 15, was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was released on parole in 2019 for good behavior on one condition: that he pay for the headstone of the two victims, Larry and Morris. Jacob Taylor, 17, and Tyrone Cowman, 19, also pleaded guilty and were sentenced to 10 years in prison. The young men are still incarcerated. In December 2023, 7.5 years after committing 3 crimes, Brice Rhodes finally went to trial. And surprisingly, the trial was held without any incident on the part of the defendant. This time, he was dressed in a suit and was not shackled. Throughout the trial, the rapper remained silent. He was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge ruled that Brice could not be given the death penalty because of his low intellectual development. It just so happens that the judicial system has failed to shield the public from a monster like Brice Rhodes. Had he been convicted of assaulting his mother and his girlfriend, the tragedy would not have happened. And Christopher Jones, Larry Ordway, and Morris Gordon would still be alive. You're a real true crime fan if you've watched all the way to the end. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell to not miss new videos. Also, put a like on the video and write your opinion on the case in the comments.